and then more than 149 chapters he published. More than 875 publications are in his name, and I will be like very fascinated with his CV, and will not be going into much more details. And the other speaker we have is Dr. V.R. Rupesh Kumar. He is the clinical lead and the neurosurgical oncologist at Apollo Proton Cancer Center in Chennai. And he is the alumni of NIMHANS, passed out in 2004. And he is known for his initial work and starting the department in JIPMER in 2006. And he is the executive committee member of Skull-Based Surgery Society of India and executive committee member of Cerebrovascular Society. And he is a member in the editorial board of Neurology. To his credit, he has got publications in more than 40 impactful journals and few chapters in renowned textbooks also. And before going on to the talks, I will be just sharing my screen and give a brief outlook like how we arrive at the guidelines. Let me just share the screen. Just talking about the guidelines. Yeah, to give a brief definition of the guidelines, these are the systematically developed statements to assist practitioners and patient decisions about appropriate healthcare for specific circumstances. And the purpose of having the guidelines is to describe appropriate care based on the best available scientific evidence and broader consensus when there is no best available scientific evidence available. And it also helps in making inappropriate reduction in the inappropriate variation in the practice. And it also provides a more rational basis for referral, and it provides a focus for continuing education and promotes efficient use of resources and the correct practices. And it also acts as a focus for quality control, including audit of the work whichever is done by the professionals. And it also highlights the shortcomings of the existing literature and the existing standards and existing practices. And it suggests appropriate future research for the betterment of the care. And, if you look at what is the evidence, what we have to frame the guidelines, it is the literature, what is there in day-to-day practice, the published literature and all, which will be forming the foundation of the guidelines. And the review of the literature again is an important part of making the evidence available for forming the guidelines. And quality assessment, particularly avoiding the bias in the data, and then the key data from all this literature is important in individual studies. And then the synthesis of all this data, that is the teamwork of medical investigating team and the medical audit team and the medical data team, which will be forming a consortium to synthesize all this data and look at the quality of the body of evidence. The quality is basically divided like high quality, moderate quality, low quality, and insufficient quality. When somebody is deciding on the quality of the body of evidence, they look at the aggregate quality and then the consistency of the results and the evidence, whether it is direct evidence or indirect evidence. And then the precision of evidence is very important in deciding the quality of the body of evidence. And the final thing, very important, is the applicability of all this evidence in framing the recommendations. When you look at the evidence which is gathered, it is classified as class 1, 2, 3. I'm giving this brief outlook because in the talks we are going to come across all these terms frequently. in the recommendations and the based evidence. So class 1 evidence is based on prospective randomized control trial. Class 2 is prospective clinical study or retrospective analysis of reliable data, including observational or cohort, prevalence or case control studies. And class 3 evidence is again based on retrospective study, including database or registry reviews, large series of case reports and expert opinions. And the technology assessment is mainly for the evidence of a device, like accuracy of the device, reliability, and the therapeutic potential, and the cost effectiveness of using the devices in the clinical practices. And based on this evidence, the recommendation is given as level 1 recommendation 2 or 3. And level 1 recommendation is convincingly justifiable based on available scientific information, mainly based on class 1 data and strong class 2 evidence if randomized testing is inappropriate or not available. Conversely, low quality or a contradictory class 1 data may be insufficient to support a level 1 recommendation. If you look at level 2 recommendation, it is reasonably justifiable based on it strongly supports supported by the expert opinion. Usually, this is supported by class 2 data or a preponderance of class 3 evidence. Level 3 recommendation is again supported by available data, but scientific evidence is lacking in this recommendation. It is generally supported by class 3 data, useful for educational purposes, and it also guides the future clinical research. And the Scottish people have gone further into grading of these recommendations, like A, B, C, D, on data available, particularly the meta-analysis and the systematic review of the data available. And if you project all this evidence and the recommendations, this is the final this thing, like level of evidence 1A is based on meta-analysis of randomized control trials, and it is the it gives rise to a grade A recommendation. And 1B evidence is there should be at least one randomized control trial, and it again a level A recommendation. And 2A is at least one well-designed control study, but without randomization. The level of recommendation is B. And 2B evidence is based on at least one well-designed quasi-experimental design, and the grade of recommendation is B. And class 3 evidence is based on at least one non-experimental descriptive study, whether a comparative or a correlation or a case study, and that may lead to a grade B recommendation. And level 4 evidence is based on expert committee reports, opinions, and then the consensus and the experience of respected authorities. That will give rise to grade C recommendations. And when we come across all this, the evidence and the recommendations and the guidelines, there are some controversies and limitations. Few of them are like marked heterogeneity with respect to the patient group, the intervention and the setting, and to the outcomes that are relevant at each stage of recovery of a particular disease, or the small numbers of the group and the ethical considerations due to many patients lacking in the mental capacity, particularly in the neurological disorders, to give fully informed consent, conforming to the application of randomized control trial designs. And then the ethical issues may come into controversies, particularly when the randomization of patient to no treatment or even a standard care is taken up, when there is expanding body of evidence of effectiveness of a mode of therapy which is readily available. And then the last issue is the funding issue, in particular in the long-term projects, which is also a limitation in framing the guidelines. This is the basic data I wanted to give, particularly for the sake of the junior colleagues and the postgraduates, and because we will come across all these terms repeatedly in the next talks. Now I would like to invite Dr. Ashok Mahapatra sir to share his screen and proceed with his talk on current guidelines in traumatic brain injuries. Sir, over to you, sir.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon to all. I thank all the organization and also the Tamil Nadu, Telangana Neuro Club for giving me opportunity to talk. It is a very important aspect of management of neurosurgical condition like head injury, because I believe head injury, GLAM and management of the pediatric neurosurgery can cover up about 2/3 of neurosurgery. And if we know the management of head injury, which comprises average 20 to 25% work of a general neurosurgeon. So today we can talk about the head injury management. If we look at the different protocols, as early as 1996, Dr. Romani and myself wrote a protocol, guidelines of management of head injury and spinal cord injury, which was 54 pages and published under the banner of NSI, Neurological Society of India. And that was very much accepted, but I suppose it has now become outdated because that was era when the MRI was not routinely followed. Now the aim and objective, Dr. Syed has spoken a lot of things. Main aim is to have a uniformity treatment, because if you do not have a uniformity treatment of guidelines, you cannot compare the data. So if you have to have a uniform data, then you have to compare and then contrast what are the data available across the world and provide the optimal care. I understand if we have guideline, a center best equipped can have better guidelines, but when you talk about optimal guidelines which can be doable, applicable and easily practicable, that will provide the optimal care, because we believe that there is suboptimal care given to head injury patient, because many neurosurgeons think head injury is not a cup of tea for them. So in many places, head injury is a neglected topic. When you talk about guidelines, it can be also named as protocol, principle, guideline, method of management of optimal care. It can be anything, or it can be SOPs. So the basic concept is that you have made down the criteria or principles in which you manage the patient a particular protocol. So that will be the purpose, whatever it may be, protocol, principle, guideline, whatever, it is the same. So the purpose of these guidelines are very many. There are many major points and minor points. Let us say we have a SOP or standard operative procedure for the casualty. There may be 100 points, but you will also see the major points should never be clouded, because it has been seen across the world, if the major points are followed 100% and minor points are missed even 20%, the general outcome is not overall not different. So the question is that what are the major points which affects the real management, and what are the minor points which can affect to some extent, but maybe of research and data collection point of view. So that is the reason we have to say there is a major and minor points. What is the legal standing? It has to have legal standing so that everybody know what is the guidelines. If any time there is a litigation, then it can protect the practitioner. But more importantly, to have a uniform policy, our doctor body should approve it. Like guidelines should be approved by NSI, NSSI and Neurotrauma Society of India. Unless we have got a legitimate approval of a society, even a guideline you follow, your colleagues are not going to support you. That is very important to understand. And you have to see about previous guidelines. If you look at the previous guidelines, then the problem is that why the guideline fails. The guidelines fail because they may not be user friendly, they may be too bulky, it may be not doable, and all the investigation and follow-up in enlisted may not be physical possible. Because a country like India, people coming to long distance, they may not come for follow-up. So basically many criteria for which guidelines do not work. So the guideline in general has to be principle, legally valid, it should not be extensive, should be able to be followed by everything. It should not be very sophisticated and lengthy, so that it is doable and our practitioner can easily follow from small town to a larger institute. So these are the principles I have already told. It should not be selective, it should be across all category of head injury. Why it is difficult? It takes time, it requires cooperation. If people don't cooperate, they will not be able to manage it. It requires attitude, because many of our attitude is practitioner. We are in a hurry. We don't have time and attitude and temperament to follow protocol. That is the reason it is very important to understand paperwork should not be very lengthy. If it is too much lengthy, then it is not going to work. So examples are Glasgow Coma Scale, which have been cited more than 2 million times. So it is so simple that everybody across the world follow a guideline for Glasgow Coma Scale. Brain Trauma Foundation, European guidelines for head injury, Australian guide for TBI, Alfred Trauma Center guide. So there are hundreds, and most importantly, ATLS guideline. So these are different guidelines. It is important to understand if we are going to practicing in a group of places, you should have uniform guidelines so that they understand each other. Now we'll talk about guidelines for managing pre-hospital care on the way and also in the hospital. So we all know A, B, C, D. I'm not going to talk too much about that. We all know why oxygenation is very important. It is not ventilation or no ventilation. It is very important for all of us to see that we are giving enough oxygen to the brain. So the guideline number 1 to protect brain and create less damage. Second thing is that there should be no hypovolemia and circulation to be adequately maintained. What fluid you use, how much fluid you use, that will vary from availability and person who dealing with the patient. So the oxygenation and maintenance of blood pressure are two important guidelines for getting the best result. Now you have to have primary survey. All coma patients must be examined for all parameters. In Glasgow Coma Scale, except the 3 parameters, other parameters are not included, which are the pupillary size, chest expansion, and other aspects of trauma elsewhere in the body. So one has to see all these parameters which are directly impact on the, for example, temperature. If a person is admitted with 100°F or above, or 200 blood sugar or above, these are single parameter which can cause the death. So we have in a multivariate analysis, temperature and blood sugar doesn't matter. But if you do a single variate analysis, these are the independent prognostic factors. So it is very important to understand. Now in primary care, one must understand, is there a need for CT scan, cervical spine, ECG monitoring? These are the questions. There is no simple guidelines, because if I say every patient of head injury has to have CT scan, it won't stand to reason. Then we have a discrimination by the clinician, what situation he will admit a patient and do the test as per requirement of the patient. The secondary problem is that to assess the brain damage. The secondary assessment, you have to see how we can reduce the damage of the brain, because that is the things what is possible. Primary damage is irreversible and secondary damage are preventable, or secondary damage can be minimized to give a better chance to the patient for survival. So it is very important for us that when you form any guidelines for the preliminary care, pre-hospital care, transfer the patient, all the simple things have to be looked after. So monitor closely. Monitor for what? Monitor for very simple things like blood pressure and respiration and pulse oximetry. Because many of us are not fortunate to have ATLS ambulance, which is expensive, may not be associated with nurse and technician. So even you have an advanced ambulance, it not necessarily means that patient will be monitored during his transport from the trauma site to the hospital. So we have to very simple thing like pulse oximetry, blood pressure and respiration. So we have to also think what is the infrastructure required so that guideline will be doable. It is can be monitored closely. We should have manpower, take advice from others from time to time. Sometime a doctor may be alone and he may not be there. So the junior has to take advice from specialists. So if a protocol is there and it is 1 or 2 person neurosurgery and they may not be available that time, but the person must be trained to see in absence of a super specialist, the person who managing protocol can take advice from time to time. It's very important to understand. Then what is important to when you transfer? Unless you have clear-cut guideline to transfer, then you are not necessary. Which patient transfer? And during transfer, again secure the airway. You may secure the airway at the site of accident. But during the transfer, the tube may get displaced, patient may be dyspneic, patient may vomit and aspirate. All these things are important during transfer, and transfer should not be done discriminately, risking the patient life. And during that transport, one has to document all the parameters. There is no point of telling that every parameter was normal during at the place of accident, but when it deteriorated, we do not know. Because sometimes our patients have to travel 200 to 500 kilometers to get a neurosurgical center. So during the transfer, again, our aim is to see prevent brain damage. Entire concept of protocol-based management guideline to see partial tension of oxygen is above 90 millimeters of mercury, PCO2 between 35 or 40, and blood pressure systolic above 90. If we follow 3 parameters during the transport, in the casualty, and at the time of accident, if a doctor is there, we will be able to save lives. So this protocol is more important to see brain is protected by preventing the secondary brain damage. Now we talk about anticonvulsant. Are you hurried to give anticonvulsant because in coma at the site of the accident or during the transport? We have not used complete routinely. It's not indicated. None of the study has shown class 1 or class 2 evidence routine use of anticonvulsant increase the patient survival or reduce the morbidity. But if the person has to give anti-epileptics and severe traumatic brain injury, not in case of open compound injury, then they can give for 10 to 15 days to tide over the serious patient, because during the first 2 weeks of accident, the epileptic fits can increase the intracranial pressure. So here again, we have to talk about ventilation, ICP lowering, and reducing metabolism. This is very, very important to understand to protect brain. If we have to protect brain, we have to quickly see that. So these are the things hard we can do, level 1, level 2, and level 3 centers. Then in this part of conclusion, both primary and secondary cares are important, because primary and secondary care till the hospital, reaching the hospital is very important. So we must understand these protocols are so simple, so doable, it can be done at any level in our country. Now you have to think at hospital. Again, once you reach the hospital in casualty, large number of people are not properly managed in casualty. Again, casualty checklist should see again whether the airway is not displaced during transport, is the airway is unilateral ventilation or bilateral ventilation, is there long collapse, is the oxygenation maintained, what is the blood pressure like. Blood pressure may be normal during the transport, but if there is an intra-abdominal injury, is there soft tissue injury, is there fracture, there could be blood pressure fall during the transport. So all these things should be part of protocol to evaluate. There is no point of thinking a doctor was transferring a patient and he has seen everything perfectly and nothing has gone wrong. Casualty, no place for complacency and negligence. So these things are also monitored. So X-ray cervical spine. As a protocol, every patient who is in coma or every patient where there is swelling in the cervical, he should have a cervical spine X-ray. Because unless we do it, we will be missing large number of patients with cervical spine injury. So biochemical and hematological, why biochemical parameter? Because large number of people have metabolically unstable. During the metabolic problem, they go to catabolic stage, and the biochemical changes like sodium abnormality, potassium abnormality, and urea can go high. And this happens to 50 to 75% of cases. So in ICU admission, one has to see what type of patient goes to ICU. Do all severe head injury with normal ventilation go to ICU? These are questionable. We have not been able to show a patient electively ventilated has better outcome. The question is that ventilating a patient is a double edge open, and one has to very carefully ventilate a patient. That is the reason when you take a patient to ICU, you can always again monitor the oxygen saturation and Glasgow Coma Scale and the patient clinical condition. And mannitol and dehydration and hypotonic saline is a part of protocol depending on what the clinician want to do. So anti-epileptic medicine given for a long time has not shown any difference. All the randomized studies have shown whatever antibiotics, anti-epileptic, there is no difference. Whether it is phenytoin, valproate, or any other thing, it doesn't make any difference. So overall, anti-epileptic, somebody can give for 10 to 15 days, but it has no impact on the outcome. Anti-edema measure, we all give anti-edema measure. Too much of anti-edema measure is not necessary. Whether you want to give the mannitol or hypotonic saline is a personal choice. But whatever hypotonic fluid you give, it should not be given more than 3 to 5 days, because after that it's going to produce metabolic derangement. It will produce hyponatremia, and also kidney problem. So we would not like our serious head injury patient go to metabolic disturbances. So one has to be very careful in the guideline. Role of steroid. Generally, we say steroid is not indicated in severe head injury. But I, as a clinician for 45 years, I believe many of these serious head injury have got hypothalamic disturbances. I did large number of study dealing with the endocrinal disturbances in severe head injury. And if we give small amount of steroid in a stress situation and small amount of thyroxine, it also helps. In my hospital, I give small. It is not an internationally accepted protocol, but we know in a catabolic phase, in a stress situation, pituitary hormones are secreted less. In all my books I published, there are chapters on hypopituitarism and endocrine disturbances in head injury. So these are the part of the protocol. IV fluid, I have told, our aim is to keep the patient euvolemic. We cannot either overhydrate or underhydrate the patient. We have to choose the fluid and maintain the electrolyte diligently, because electrolyte disturbances occur between 50 to 75% cases around 3 to 5 days of severe head injury ICU. So unless somebody is very carefully treating the electrolyte, patient may go to hyponatremia and kidney problem. ICP monitoring is not routinely indicated. All Brain Trauma Foundation and all the prospective randomized control study have shown ICP monitoring can help you to reduce the ICP by giving appropriate method. But ultimately, ICP monitoring neither has reduced the mortality or has improved the outcome of the head injury patient. So whether ICP monitoring is routinely indicated, these are questionable, but if one has facility, one can do it. Ventilation. Aim of the ventilation is maintain the oxygenation, because that good oxygenation, adequate oxygenation will prevent brain damage. So whether you do it by U ventilation or a hyperventilation has double wedge open. Unless you maintain the PCO2 correctly, if you produce hypocarbia, it will also produce brain damage. Moreover, the ventilator associated pneumonia also very problem. So one has to use ventilation judiciously, not indiscriminately. So a clinician should see which patient merit a ventilation and which doesn't. Our aim is to provide the damaged man adequate oxygen so that further brain damage doesn't happen because of hypoxia. Hypothermia is still controversial. Moderate hypothermia is recommended by many people, but recent Brain Trauma Foundation, 4th Brain Trauma Foundation guideline 2007 doesn't recommend it, because it has not shown indiscriminately or conclusively it has increased the outcome, whereas it has got its own risk and problems. So it is not recommended. Severe TBI, DC is also important. But is the DC, decompressive craniotomy, a panacea for severe head injury? No. All the randomized study has shown in selective cases with proper evaluation, in patient with refractory ICP, it will reduce the mortality of 6 months. However, long-term outcome and morbidity is not different. Moreover, we produce more vegetative patients. So people from death is transformed to vegetative state, which may be worse for a society like India, where the per capita income is low. So routine DC is not recommended. This is also about DC. Nutrition is very important. What we do not understand, these people are in a catabolic phase, and after 24 hours of injury, if we do not adequately calorie supplied, the person will be catabolic phase. A person in catabolic phase or with low caloric output will have a poorer prognosis. So we have to maintain a calorie intake of 18,000 to 2,000, 1,800, 2,000. This is very, very, very important, because we believe that giving 5 bottles of saline or dextrose is good enough, not good enough. Our mortality in India is high because we do not look at the nutrition point of view. Antibiotics. Antibiotics is very important. One has to follow the protocol as per prevailing the antibiotics policy of the hospital. If I say my policy in Bhubaneswar or AIIMS is different, then different, because the bacteria can be different, antibiotics availability can be different, the hospital policy may be different. People in coma require antibiotics, yes. it has to be as per the hospital guidelines. So I cannot bluntly say I can prescribe a given antibiotics. I would say everybody should follow the prophylaxis antibiotic guideline as prevailing in their hospital. ICP monitoring not routinely recommended. Not recommended. Not recommended. So CPP is very important, but CPP must be maintained 60. If ICP is not going to help you, CPP is not going to help you, because it's much more difficult to maintain and manipulate CPP than ICP. So if I say the guidelines have there is no conclusive level 1, level 2 evidence, ICP monitoring helps, so also the CPP doesn't help. This is what insufficient level 1, level 2, nothing. We don't know whether the CPP manipulation helps or don't help. So in short, I have told what is the guideline, how the guideline is helpful for uniformity and research and data, how the legal binding, what should be the criteria guideline pre-hospital stay, transport and casualty, what are the guidelines for severe head injury. So far the ICP is concerned, CPP is concerned, monitor or fluid is concerned, decompressive connectivity is concerned, and their outcome is concerned. Last 20 or 25 minutes, I have been able to pass some message because headline is so extensive and so many guidelines are available. It is not possible to cover it in 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Yeah, strictly as you said, you have enumerated the guidelines so well for any center, whether it is rural or urban or any nook and corner of the country also. They are very simple to follow and then very practical. And now we'll go to the next talk, sir. We'll take the questions after the second talk, sir.
No problem.
Can you share out the screen, sir? Yeah, Dr. Rupesh, I invite you to give your talk on current guidelines on spinal cord injury. Can you share your screen?
Take it out. Thank you, Dr. Amir. Good afternoon, sir. It was very nice listening to a lecture for a long time. So we really enjoyed it. So now, after head injury guidelines, I will speak on spinal cord injuries. The principles are almost same, but slightly different because the manifestations are different. So for guidelines, one need to identify a little bit of biomechanics to understand. As we know, the 14% of vertebral column fractures result in cord injury. So it's not all the fractures will lead to cord injury. Conversely, if you see a cervical cord injury, there will be associated fractures in 56%. If it is a thoracic, there will be 100% because of the Laro canal, and it is in lumbar, it will be 85%. As we see the spine as a different components, the commonest injuries occur where there are junctions like immobile versus a mobile segment, like Atlanta-Oxian, thoracolumbar, cervicothoracic. So wherever the junction between an immobile and a relatively hypermobile segment, there only the injury occurs, and roughly 50% are incomplete. So they are salvageable and we need to give our best secondary care. So if you see, the size of the canal differs. The mid-thoracic spine is the most narrowest portion. So any injury there is going to cause almost 100% incidence of a cord injury. We should always forget about the vascular injury, which always happens, especially at the cervicothoracic level. So we need to be aware of that because sometimes you may have extensive ischemia particularly happening at this particular level. We need to understand a bit of pathophysiology so that it will help us in guiding the management of spinal cord injuries. As we see, like a head injury where there is a primary and secondary injury, even in cervical cord or any other cord matter, there is a primary injury which happens at the time of trauma, and following which the cascade of events which happens constitutes the secondary injury. The secondary injury, we are not very clear like a brain injury how it is, but most often it manifests in a spinal cord hemorrhage, edema, ischemia, infarct, and thrombosis, microthrombi. All those things are the manifestations of a secondary injury which cause ongoing damage which may not be at the initial level. That is the first primary reason why patients after an injury, they continue to deteriorate for the first 72 hours. And this is the simple reason that the ongoing cascade of events happen. So as surgeons, as physicians, as clinicians, we need to identify and preserve the functioning cord so that we don't damage or allow the cord to damage further because of the secondary cascade of events. So the whole idea of this lecture is to guide the practices which is best possible to prevent secondary injury to the cord. Now, two things which we need to know when we are dealing with a cord injury is one is the spinal shock and another is the neurogenic shock. Neurogenic shock is something because of the disturbances of the your sympathetics and the chain which is occurring in the thoracic level, which can cause a catecholamine surge and then subsequently catecholamine depletion, whereby giving rise to significant hypotension, bradycardia and all those things. So that is called the neurogenic shock. It is because of the interruption of the autonomic pathways, and this leads to decreased systemic vascular resistance, leading to inotropism compromise, etc. And also it can cause hypothermia. The second shock which we need to understand is about the spinal shock. There are a lot of myths and mysteries about the spinal shock. Spinal shock is nothing but the loss of reflexes below the particular level of injured segment. As we see a flaccid areflexia which subsequently improves over a period of time. There have been 4 phases which have been postulated. The areflexia, which is from the day 0 to 1, there is an immediate one. Slowly you will all see that the reflexes come back. So the initial return of reflex happens between 1 to 3 days, and early hyperreflexia sometimes happens between days 4 to 28, and then there is a phase called the late hyperreflexia which happens almost a month up to 1 year. So, but it's not very clear how long the spinal reflexia is going to happen. So it may be different for different patients. So there are a lot of classifications or grading, like a Glasgow Coma scale for a head injury. The one which is commonly applicable and it's quite easy to follow is the ASIA scoring. It's by the American Spinal Injury Association, where ASIA A is complete motor and sensory impairment. The ASIA B is sensory will be incomplete but motor is complete. ASIA C is incomplete motor but less than half of the muscle groups. ASIA D more than half of muscle groups but not normal, and ASIA A is normal. So this is relatively simple to understand. So somebody says, okay, he belongs to ASIA C, that we may know that, okay, the level of injury, it's not a complete, it is incomplete. So anything above, anything not A is an incomplete injury, so that we have to be more pursuing the treatment in these patients. Now, Professor Mahapatra sir was talking about the pre-hospital management of head injury. So it's very, very important that transit, many of the spine injuries happen actually during the transit, the secondary damage, the cord injury. There may be a fracture, but the cord will be injured during the transit because of the improper transport, because of the unawareness of the spine injury. So majority of the secondary cord damage can be prevented if these patients are taken care very well. So that means a lot of queries, questions, how to immobilize them. So, but there are some recommendations also. There are whom we are teaching our pre-clinicians or the ambulance people, or which are the patients who don't need immobilization. So we have some criteria for that. Those who are awake, alert, and they are not intoxicated. Those who don't complain of neck pain, and those who do not have any abnormal motor or sensory examination, and patients with penetrating trauma. So these patients, if we see these patients, then they need not have a strict immobilization criteria. They can be mobilized normally. Now, what are the immobilization criteria in the pre-hospital stage? So there are a lot of things. How do they transport these patients from the accident site to the hospital? So the best would be in ambulance is to use a simple rigid cervical collar with a supportive block on both the sides on a spinal board. So we have a spinal board which is available, and we need to, that limits motion to a significant extent, and that will be relatively safe way. Vis-a-vis the old concept of putting sandbags on either side, preventing all those things are not recommended. So the best thing is to just put a simple rigid cervical collar without movement of the neck, just and then transfer the patient to spinal board. Same way, once the patient comes to the hospital, so usually they should be log rolled from the board to the bed. So that is the best practice, and ideally they should be reaching a hospital within 30 minutes of wherever they are picked up. The spinal board is a transport device only. So as soon as a patient reaches a hospital, they have to be, the spinal board is no longer for in hospital, it is only for in the ambulance and during the transport. So patients kept on more time for the spinal board can develop pressure sores. So we should be very, very careful that they should be removed, and they should be shifted carefully to the available hospital mattresses. Now, airway is important for head injury, absolutely, but for high cervical injury also the airway is equally important, as we know, because like the same pathophysiology, adequate oxygenation is important in a patient with spine injury as well. So we know that those patients, unlike head injury, we may be able to protect the airway if they are not unconscious. So they will be at least able to protect the airway. The only problem will be if they have paralytic ileus, there is a risk of aspiration. So the airway is not as important as, because if the patient is conscious, they will be able to protect the airway at least in the initial period of time till they come to the hospital, especially for a very high, low cord injury. But in case of the patient is unconscious, and if you suspect a head injury, then it becomes our priority to secure the airway. But even otherwise, if the patient is hypoventilating, then we also need to secure our airway, very important. So how do we, very, very important is that most of the time the patient lands in the hospital, and there are some junior medical officers who are there in the hospital to take care, and if they are not properly well equipped, they may cause further damage during intubation. So it should be very, very important that a cervical spine suspected injury patient should be intubated by a well-trained intensivist or anesthetist who are well-versed without any struggle. So that is very important. So what we call is called the rapid sequence induction, which is used, and before intubation of the patient, we need to remove the collar because it is very important, and there is no flexion, no extension. Ideal, if you have a fiber optic scope, that is the best, but many places at casualty level you may not have. So the best way to intubate a patient with a cervical spine injury is something called the manual inline cervical spine stabilization. So what you do is, one person should not be able to do, there should be one person at the end of the head and other person who can align the cervical spine. So we need two trained doctors to have proper intubation in a patient without causing any neck movement. That is important. So this is something which everybody has to understand. Cervical spine movement should be very minimized during laryngoscopy, especially flexion, because flexion is more dangerous, can cause further cord damage than a little bit of extension. The one important precaution what we need to take is that suddenly some patients can go for asystole. That happens in almost 20%, especially in cervical cord injury, because of the unopposed vagal tone. So we need to be very informative about that, and we need to be ready and equipped with atropine in case of a patient suddenly going for an asystole because of the high intubation. Any reflex, any response or any vagal stimulation can cause asystole because of the unopposed vagal tone in this patient. So it's very, very important when we are doing suctioning, when we are doing laryngoscopy, and especially we need to have our atropine ready in case of patient developing sudden severe bradycardia or asystole. Now, one important caution or note is that use of succinylcholine. So if you ever know that this fact is something many people will not be aware of, if a patient needs an intubation later, probably after third day or fourth day of trauma because of hypopnea or hypoventilation, every precaution should be taken that S-choline, succinylcholine, which is given before intubation should not be given. It is absolutely contraindicated because of the cord injury, there will be sudden denervation, and this succinylcholine causes this problem of life-threatening hyperkalemia. So it should be cautioned to all the practicing medical officers that you should not be using succinylcholine before intubation in a patient with a cord injury. That is very, very important because of the hyperexcitability. Now coming to, we have told about the airway, so breathing. So very important that which are the patients who need ventilation, which are the patients whom we can just manage without ventilation. just oxygenation. Any cord injury above T1, that means the intercostals are paralyzed, so they will be depending only on a diaphragmatic breathing. If the injury is above, that is around C3 to 5, even the phrenic nerve nucleus are also damaged, and those patients 100% they need ventilation. So they are more likely to become ventilator dependent if the lesion is above C3 and especially if it is going to be complete injury. So we see that, so C3 to 5 is the phrenic nerve nucleus and D1 to D12 will be the intercostal. So we know the amount and degree. The most important muscle for breathing is of course diaphragm, not your intercostal muscles. So diaphragmatic paralysis is the one which makes a patient permanently ventilator dependent. So if you want to have breathing, there should be one caution. You would have observed that patients will not be comfortable when they made to elevate their head, and these patients are more comfortable in their lying flat position, because it is only in that position the diaphragm is inside. The abdominal contents will push the diaphragm towards the thorax, so the diaphragm has percussion to move out so that they are comfortable. If you make the patient sit, by gravity the diaphragm may come down and diaphragm may not have much excursion, so the patient will start developing dyspnea. So that is why patients with cord injury is better to maintain them in the flat, and the moment you start elevating it, they develop this type of respiratory difficulty. Sometimes what happens is you put them on ventilator because they need when breathing, especially a high cervical cord injury. The question is, when do we start weaning them off? That's a very, very difficult thing which has to be combinedly, jointly taken by the intensivist and the attending physician and the neurosurgeon. And most of the time we will be able to successfully wean them off ventilator if the lesions are below C5 or C6. That is because anything above C4, very likely they may become very difficult to wean them off ventilator. There are some predictors of tracheostomy. So when do you do tracheostomy? Especially in Asia A, you know that a complete injury, most of the time they may be permanently ventilator dependent and they may need a tracheostomy. If a large extent of the lesion, if these patients are a smoker and pre-existing lung disease, those are the patients who may end up in long-term ventilation, and better to do early tracheostomy than wait until the last minute. If you suspect there are a lot of chance of this patient developing lung collapse and atelectasis, so your intensivist will be very familiar with this. So always we need to use a very high tidal volume, 10 to 15 ml per kg, to prevent lung atelectasis. And these are the patients who are going to be in a little bit on longer term ventilator. So ventilator associated pneumonia with plasmapheresis swelling is very, very going to be common, and every step has to be taken to prevent. And if it's a chronic patient, they may have sometimes a diaphragmatic pacing may be required. Now, the most important, at least we have ventilator, the other major challenge what we will be going to be facing is the bradycardia and the hypotension. So what we should do and what we should not do in a patient with a cardiac compromise, because you know that your autonomic nervous system is damaged and you have unopposed vagal tone, and these patients will be having combination of bradycardia and hypotension, and it's very, very sometimes they become very refractory and you may be failing your duty if you are unable to identify it. And there are a lot of recent guidelines on to how to choose the fluid, what medications to choose. So there may be some very peculiar features. The patient may be hypotensive and brady, but they may not have cold clammy. They may be still warm, and they may be because of the vasodilatation. So this peripheral pooling, peripheral vasodilatation may not be causing a peripheral chillness. They may be having peripheral warmth. And usually if you see the systolic BP will be something around 80 to 90 in these patients. And one important thing is that hypotension in this group of patients are usually fluid resistant. Usually our initial attempt will be to give them fluids to bring the BP, but whatever fluid you give is going to go into the peripheries and it may not still able to rise. So most often you may need a vasopressors in this particular group of patients. At the same time, you also need to be very careful that you cannot over transfuse and hyperfluid, because it can end up in a pulmonary edema. So there's a little bit of balance. So the best way is to put a catheter, invasive catheter, and measure the pressure, especially if the lesion is above D4, because that is the time when, because you have some optimum fluid management, you don't overhydrate them, at the same time you hydrate them properly to prevent a hypotension. Now the question will be, what is the fluid of choice which you want to give? Of course, it's a normal saline because it's a good crystalloid and it maintains in the circulation, it's isotonic, and that will be the initial choice. Do not give a lot of colloids because again there will be a lot of pulmonary edema in these patients. So best is to give normal saline. What will be the target BP which you want to aim in these patients is that, so anything in a blunt cord injury, the recommendation is more than 85 millimeters of mercury for at least 72 hours. But some guidelines say up to 7 days you need to maintain to have a good cord perfusion so that the secondary cord damage, secondary cord ischemia doesn't happen. If it is a penetrating injury, then it is slightly different. It can have a map of less than more than 65 is sufficient, but if it is a blunt cord injury, a map of 85 or above is ideally suited, and the drug of choice to maintain this vasopressor is norepinephrine. I will tell you in the subsequent slides why norepinephrine scores over other medications. Now, there are many times you see that even in spite of giving inotrop, these patients will never pick up a BP. So you need to identify what is the cause, and many often you need to identify and check serum cortisol levels. If the patient is persistently refractory to your medications and the patient BP is unable to come up, it's wise to do serum cortisol in these patients. And if they sometimes have hypocortisolemia, it's better to give hydrocortisone, and you see that they start responding to your inotropic agents. So this is very important to note. Anybody with cord injury, if they are not able to maintain the BP, then please check your cortisol levels and manage with them with hydrocortisone. You may be able to successfully manage it. There are some patients who will become long-term inotrops, and if the moment you stop your IV inotrops, they start developing. So there are some oral medications which are available, especially midodrine. It's quite expensive, but it can be used. It can be given orally, and so that the BPs can be maintained. So, and also use that is stockings, elastic stockings, that will prevent your fluid accumulation in the legs to pump the fluid, and at least it can push the supply into the vascular system to maintain some degree of hypotension. So these are the measures you should know if the patients are having refractory hypotension. Now the fluid of choice. What we should understand is in a cervical or high thoracic lesions, patients will have both hypotension and bradycardia. Drugs which have chronotropic, inotropic and vasoconstrictor, they will be the ideal agents. So the best thing is norepinephrine. So norepinephrine has all these properties. It is inotropic, it is chronotropic, and also vasopressor. So any high cord injury or a cervicothoracic injury, the drug of choice would be a norepinephrine, and dopamine is like the second choice. I'll tell you why dopamine is less preferred. For a lower thoracic, hypotension will be the main problem, so they don't need a chronotropic agent. So a drug like phenylephrine should be good enough for a lower thoracic injury, or a higher thoracic, cervical or a thoracic, it will be better to give norepinephrine. There's one interesting study by Althoff. What he did was he put a spinal catheter in these patients and he measured the intrathecal pressure and also the MAP, and he something like a cerebral perfusion pressure. He measured the spinal perfusion pressure, and he used various agents, and we found that the norepinephrine was a drug which was able to maintain the mean arterial pressure with the lower intrathecal pressure and suppose correspondingly with a higher spinal cord perfusion pressure. So with all this in mind, the ideal choice, if the patient is hypotensive and if you want to give a medication, the first choice would be norepinephrine, especially in the cervical cord injury. Now, sometimes you will start the inotrops, but you will not be able to reduce their strength, because the moment you reduce, BP will start falling. So there are a lot of problems now which you encounter, especially the patient is going to stay with you for a longer period of time, and there are a lot of side effects associated with chronic inotropic usage, especially tachycardia, bradycardia. There are vascular ischemia of the coronary arteries because can cause some ST segment changes, especially so with dopamine. So that is why in little elderly patient above 55 years, your first choice will be norepinephrine than dopamine, because they may have a lot of other side effects. Now we are speaking about the managing the BP. Now the equally important will be that sometimes these patients have a significant bradycardia, and because of this loss of unopposed vagal activity. How do we manage a bradycardia? So how it is significant? Suddenly sometimes you feel that it's acute bradycardia in a patient, that is the first commonest cause will be a mucus plug blocking your tracheostomy site or your carina. Because as I told you, these patients can develop asystole just by intubating because of the unopposed vagal activity. The same way a mucus plug can irritate the carina, can cause hypervagal response and can cause bradycardia. So it is important to clear the airway, to do a good suctioning. Most often you see that the pulse rates will start improving, and there are sometimes refractory cause of bradycardia, and there are some medications available which you can give, especially if they are symptomatic and if the heart rate is less than 40, you can give some oral medications like salbutamol, caffeine tablets, which can keep the BP, it can antagonize the vagal activity and maintain a reasonably good pulse rate. If there are severe symptomatic bradycardia, like what you do for diaphragmatic pacing, then you have to sometimes use a coronary pacing, cardiac pacing to prevent a life-threatening bradycardia. Now, for coming to the investigation wise, the radiology, so X-ray is something gold standard which has been tested, but now that easy availability of CT scans in every center almost, so the CT scan also has become almost a standard of care, and there are many hospitals who do a trauma series where you just screen the whole body. Also, you do a fast CT of the abdomen to make sure chest X-ray so that you don't miss out any occult blunt injury. So CT and X-ray are almost part and parcel. The question will be MRI scan, when to do, and is there an indication in cervical cord injury or any other cord injury? Now there are a lot of protocols available. The commonest is called the Nexus protocol. So the question here is when you want to do X-ray of the cervical spine and whether it is indicated for all trauma patients. So there are some guidelines now when you want to do an X-ray of the cervical spine, and this Nexus protocol says there are 5 criteria. If you don't have a posterior midline pelvic tenderness, the patient is alert, not intoxicated, and if the patient does not have any other painful injury and no deficit, probably you need not do an X-ray cervical spine, and you can assume that the cervical spine is normal, provided all the criteria is met with and has a good sensitivity and specificity. There is another Canadian C-spine rule which asks you to ask 3 questions to the patient. One is age more than 65 years, and if this mechanism of injury is something, a high velocity injury, the dangerous mechanism or a fall from height, or the patient has paresthesias in extremities. So these are the patients who are more prone for injury, and then you have to do X-ray in these patients. This is the Canadian C-spine rule. If the patient does not have any of this thing above 3, and if the patient is able to actively rotate the neck 45 degrees on either side, then you can assume that this patient is not having a cervical spine trauma, and so you may avoid an X-ray cervical spine. So these are some guidelines which says when you want to do X-rays in patients. So Canadian C-spine rule is something which is commonly applied, but now because of the easy availability, it's better to do X-ray cervical spine than to worry why we have missed it. So these are some guidelines, but it may not be completely true in many of the current scenario. Now coming to the MRI. So MRI is something which is very useful. You can get more information and you can also prognosticate. The only problem is the difficulty in getting MRI in acute injury patients. Especially if you want to do the MRI, it is better to do in the first 48 hours because the ligamental injury can be easily picked up. If you delay by more than 48 hours, sometimes the ligamentous injury, there will be some clot formation, and ligamental injury cannot be picked up. And so if you want to pick up a ligamental injury, it is better to do an MRI within 48 hours. It can detect more findings than a CT scan will do. It can cause the expansion of any hematoma, spinal cord hematoma, any disc prolapse, any pre-existing cervical canal narrowing. All those things are easily available. Information will be available if you can do an MRI. You can also prognosticate these patients. Any patient who has more than 1 centimeter intraspinal hemorrhage or a T2 hyperintensity which is expanding more than 3 centimeters, prognostically they are going to be faring very poorly. So this MRI finding can also be prognostic importance, and so there are many advantages. You can also identify a vertebral artery injury which is not usually picked up by any other modality. But the problem with getting an MRI is many hospitals may not have an in-house MRI center. You may have to refer a patient outside to get an MRI, and so logistically it will be very difficult to ship them. So it requires a patient to be inside the gantry for almost 30 minutes. Patient can develop hemodynamic compromise, bradycardia, hypotension, may be very difficult to monitor them. So for 30 minutes, what is happening inside? So it's better that intensivist or an anesthetist accompanies the patient, these sick patients, when patient is undergoing MRI. But if the MRI is going to be in another center, and so it is better to wait till the patient is hemodynamically stable. So the American Association guidelines and the CNS guidelines say so it was published in 2003, and MRI cervical whole spine was done to clear the surgery. Suppose the neurosurgeon is called for an opinion for a polytrauma. So if you want to clear the cervical spine, it is normal, then the MRI cervical spine was an option to clear the cervical spine in case of all polytrauma. And patient with a fracture dislocation, and especially so before you want to reduce it, it is better to get a MRI done to rule out a disc prolapse. And in all pediatric patients with spinal cord injury, so it's better to have because you may pick up a ligamental injury. The same guidelines which was there in 2003, in 2013, it became from an option, it became a level 3 recommendation by the same organization. So now it is getting an MRI is a level 3 recommendation, and so but majority of the time we do get MRI because we have many findings which can be missed up in an X-ray or a routine CT scan. Of course, the major controversy in a cord injury is whether we want to give steroids. Because in a head injury, we know that the steroids crash trial has crashed because there is no role of steroids in the acute head injury. But it was not true because many of us still give methylprednisolone based on these two studies, the NASIS study, which was published almost 30 years back, and initially NASIS 2 suggested to give methylprednisolone loading dose and then subsequently a maintenance dose for 24 hours, and subsequently came NASIS 3, which recommended to give up to 48 hours if you are starting after 4 hours of trauma, before 8 hours. But is it worth giving? Is it really beneficial? So there are a lot of confusion. In 2002, the AANS and CNS guidelines suggested that there was some insufficient evidence to support treatment, but they did not say no to steroids. So there are many people still giving, but subsequently in 2013, the first time they came dogmatic about that, and they showed evidence against giving steroids in these patients with spinal cord injuries for simple reason, and it was not an FDA approved drug for giving for cord injuries. And there is no class 1 or class 2 evidence supporting the clinical benefits of steroids, and class 1, class 2 and class 3 evidence now suggests that high dose steroids can in fact cause more problem and can cause mortality. So steroids in UK and US, I don't think they are giving steroids. They are almost stopped giving after this 2013 recommendation by AANS and CNS. But here I think many centers still do give steroids because of the dilemma and the ambiguity, and so it is still not clear from our side. Though AANS has clearly told that it is against giving. The GM1 ganglioside was also a drug which was equally coming up at the same time where steroids were supposed to give, and again it lacked scientific evidence, though it showed in few studies that the sensory improvement was noted in patients who was administered GM1, but again it is not recommended for routine use in cord injuries. Again, like Professor Mahapatra was telling about hypothermia, in animal studies, the hypothermia was found to be beneficial in cord injury in rats, but in none of the human studies proved hypothermia as beneficial, so it is not a recommended line of treatment. Now, the other major controversy in spinal cord injury where we lack guidelines is the timing of intervention by surgery when we want to take up. But now that spinal trauma study group has now come out with a very clear stance that if you take up these patients less than 24 hours, if they are hemodynamically stable, then there is a relatively good outcome. You are preventing a secondary injury, and it has recently got published also. So if you are taking up, if the patient is hemodynamically stable, less than 24 hours is good enough and you can go ahead. What does the previous guidelines say? So previous guidelines indicated a class 2 evidence to support the fact that early surgery less than 72 hours in fact can be performed safely if the patient does not have any hemodynamic instability. It's more so if it is a bilateral locked facets and if the patient is an ongoing neurological deterioration. So these three indications, you should take up the patients at the earliest without waiting much. But however, the most controversy is you see a patient with a central cord syndrome, you don't find instability in them. You just find some disc prolapse, some cervical canal narrowing, whether you want to do a surgery immediate or you want to wait and do. That question is still yet to be answered. There are a lot of controversies. There are groups for and there are groups against. So points against surgery is that many of these times these patients do improve spontaneously, so you can avoid a surgery. And when you're decompressing in this fragile spinal cord, then you may additionally cause damage to the spinal cord. So that is the group which says against surgery. But there are some groups which say early surgery because they can address the underlying neurologic degenerative pathology. You can take out the compression, you prevent a secondary injury, and you also stabilize the spine in majority of the time, putting up the early rehabilitation process. But however, this is still a controversial topic yet to be addressed, whether in a central cord syndrome, we do want to do surgery early or late if the patient does not have instability. It's a major thing. there are some very Chinese papers who are very aggressive in managing these spinal cord injuries. So they remove the cord hematoma, they do addusolysis, they open the dura, clear all the clots, something what we do, a decompress, you do lax duroplasty. So there are a few Chinese papers which I was reading in a couple of weeks back, and which shows that they are quite aggressive in that. But I don't think there are any recommendations for that to do any intervention intradurally in the cord injury, unless when you are doing, there's an obvious dural tear, you may have to basically just to repair the dura, rather than doing heroic activities inside the intradural work is not recommended as of now. Okay, so now coming to stabilization. So the recommendation will be to stabilize this cord at the earliest, preferably 24 hours or earlier, if the patient is hemodynamically stable, and more so if the patient is deteriorating neurologically and you are preventing a secondary injury. There are some subsequent slides which tell there are crucial things which are unique to this cord injuries. Is that deep venous thrombosis, a major threat because it's a paralyzed patient with no tone, and there's a very high chance of them developing deep venous thrombosis. When do you want to give anticoagulants, and what anticoagulants, and how early you can do? So you know that, so there's an increased risk. At the same time, if you give in a patient who has a polytrauma, there are bleeding elsewhere, and you are going to propensate a bleeding. Suppose the patient has intradural hematoma, intracranial hemorrhage also in addition. So there are plus and minus for both of these. So the risk of fatal pulmonary embolism is almost 3% in spinal cord injuries, but the evidence of DVT is very high. You can see that 90% risk of them patients developing DVT. So it's very important that you need to protect them from preventing this major complication. But the recommendation is acutely injured patients, you do avoid anticoagulants, so you do mechanical. So less than 72 hours is not a safe period. You manage them, head stockings, pneumatic devices, and once patient 72 hours, almost the bleeding everywhere has stopped, patient is stable, then you can start them with either unfractionated heparin or low molecular weight heparin. But the recommendations are more for low molecular weight heparin after 72 hours. If for some reason the patient cannot get anticoagulation because of any ongoing bleeding, if any additional abdominal trauma, the patient is waiting for another surgery to happen, so you can place a AVC filter to prevent a pulmonary embolism. But you are not preventing a DVT, at least a life-threatening complication can be prevented. And the other major question is a rehabilitation, which is an unforgotten topic. We don't mind much about that, but is very crucial in these patients. When you start the rehabilitation, how early you can do. So the objectives of any rehabilitation, because we don't have we don't have much surgery to offer. Mainly the rehabilitation physiotherapy is the main thing which is going to help these patients. So you have to improve the patient's quality of life. You have to get them back to the society, and rehabilitation and physiotherapy is the most vital, and you should start doing it. There are 3 phases of that: the acute phase, subacute phase, and chronic phase. The aim and objective in an acute and subacute phase would be to prevent prevent further damage or further complications like spasticity, stiffness, and you prevent or promote the neurological recovery. That will be your aim in the first few weeks. But once the patient attains a plateau, then you need to put them on an aggressive physiotherapy model once they are hemodynamically stable. So rehabilitation starts as soon as the patient becomes medically stable. Once they are off inotropes, and if they are BP, so you can start putting them on body weight mechanisms, the conventional overgrown walking. There are a lot of things which it's beyond the scope of this lecture, but good physiotherapy and good rehabilitation goes a long way in improving the outcome, functional outcome of these patients. The other major problem what we encounter is that majority of the time you have this dysautonomia. So majority of the time patients go for paralytic ileus, and managing the bowel and bladder is almost of a crucial importance. And how do we manage it? In most of other trauma, to prevent a systemic inflammatory response, the recommendation are to start the patients on a nutrition. Early enteral feeding prevents sepsis, prevents SIRS syndrome. But can we do it in a cord injury? The answer is no, because these are the patients who are going to be paralytic ileus, and we never know when they are going to recover. So it's very important to identify when they are recovering, so you can start your enteral feeding. So the rough guideline will be that if the NG feed every 4 hours and you aspirate, and if the aspirate is less than 250, you can give the next feed. And if the aspirate is more than 250, you have to wait. So that is the rough nursing guidelines which says so how frequently you feed the spinal cord injury. Some centers do continuous feeding, but the problem in continuous feeding here is that sometimes they have an overt paralytic ileus. You are going to prevent aspiration, and patients can go for severe other problems. So it's better to give intermittent, and every 4 hours you test whether the patient can tolerate the feeding, at least in the initial part of the phase, so before starting on a continuous hourly feeding. These patients, as I told you, has unopposed or vagal activity, so they're very, very prone for hematemesis, bleeding. So you need to protect them with proton pump inhibitors, and the recommendations say even up to 6 weeks you need to give them, because you are going to reduce the ulceration from 20% to 5% if you can give a H2 antagonist or a PPA inhibitors. Sometimes patients can have persistent reflux and regurgitation. So sometimes you may have to pass the raised tube through the nasal into the duodenum. It's called the nasoduodenal tube or a nasojejunal tube to prevent reflux and aspiration. Not very common, but in a very small subset of patients, it may be needed to bypass the pylorus to place your raised tube tip in the duodenum. The other things are most often they are going to be a catheter dependent, so they cannot void. So you need to have good bladder program. So insertion of a urinary catheter is mandatory if you suspect this even if it is incomplete cord injury. You may have to initially at least support them with a indwelling catheter, and the question will be when to remove the catheter. So always you can try. So when you want to try is that the patient starts getting some response, some sensations if they are able to hold the bladder, and the patient is not on any IV fluids. If the patient is intake is less than 2 liters, and if the patient has no diuresis, you can probably safe it out and start the patients on intermittent catheterization. So begin intermittent catheterization by every 4 to 6 hours, and the goal is to obtain no more than 400. If every time you obtain more than 400, probably you have to reduce your intermittent catheterization duration to less frequent. And a condom catheter is not advised because many times they can develop huge bladder without any pain, and it can secondarily cause renal damage and chronic renal damage. Most of these patients are going to be in the bed, so it's very, very important. Nursing care is very, very important to prevent them from developing pressure sores. So invariably they develop pressure sores, and it's very important to put them on the special beds, and also frequently turn the patients provided they are stable enough to do that. Otherwise, there's good alpha mattresses, and water beds are not recommended. It's ideally the barrel type of alpha mattresses are the one which is preferred for a complete cord injury, and there are a lot of scores available to check periodically, and a plastic surgeon will be an equal pivotal role in preventing and managing these pressure sores in these patients. Sometimes these patients have severe pain. It's called the neuropathic pain, which is very difficult to control with the routine analgesics. So they may need medications like gabapentin, pregabalin, and amitriptyline to take care of the pain. So there are a lot of recommendations, but they also have sedation. But slowly over a period of time, they get acclimatized and they can tolerate these doses. The other important thing is the spasticity. These patients initially they are reflexive, but then they develop spasticity. So baclofen, the maximum dose which we can go up to 120 milligrams, but on a chronic period, if the spasticity is going to be problematic, these patients also can develop benefit from intrathecal baclofen pump.
Rupesh.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Dr. Ashok Mohapatra has got some meeting, it seems.
Yeah, okay.
Sir, so you have to leave now, sir?
I have to reach there. Anybody wants to ask question, how much time is going to take? I have to leave in 5 minutes. 5 minutes time.
Okay. How much time we have, Rupesh?
I think the last slide, another 2 slides.
Okay, sir, we'll finish it. Okay. Okay, go ahead, Rupesh.
Yeah. So we should know that in patients, up to 80% of patients with incomplete paraplegia will be able to stand by 12 months, and up to 50% will be able to walk within 12 months. So we need to be a little bit aggressive in managing these incomplete cord injuries to reasonably bring them to a relatively good quality of life. So these are the future. So we don't have still answers. Stem cells are still experimental research, and we don't have much choice. So this is my last slide. So what the take home message, what we do is that these early intubation mechanical ventilation is required in patients with high cervical injuries. Use of high dose methylprednisolone is not recommended. Thromboembolism is very important. So you need to start them with heparin at 72 hours post trauma. And the goal is to maintain a good perfusion. So MAP of about 85 for a blunt or incomplete penetrating injury, and consider early tracheostomy in high cervical injury and surgical decompression in the early period, less than 24 hours is going to be more useful to this patient. So this is the recent guidelines which has come up. So I request everybody to go through this paper published by AO Spain. It's very, very practical, useful tips are available. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupesh. You covered it so nicely, and it is an exhaustive coverage. Yeah, covering every aspect of the spinal cord injury. Yeah. Sir, Dr. Mahapatra, sir. Yeah. I have a question about the latest this thing, sir, regarding the traumatic brain injury guidelines. The latest guidelines, the same authors have come up with an algorithm for treating pediatric severe brain injury based
I
on.
did not go to pediatric in detail because in 20 minutes, because there are a lot of pediatric guidelines, also guidelines for admission of minor head injury. Because I only gave the broad outline of the pre-hospital, casualty and hospital care. Pediatric is totally separate. That will take another 10-15 minutes.
Yes.
I had some slide, but because of constant, you can carry on. Yes, in constant time, I made as little slide. I made only 40 slides.
Yes. Yes.
Because this is not exactly same as pediatric guideline. There are 4 or 5 pediatric guidelines. So I did not want to go to confuse the people. Pediatric versus adult. It's a general guideline.
Sir, I just have a question, sir. Like, how they have come out with the algorithm based on the 4 pathways, like the ICP and then the CPP and then PBRO2. How important they are even in adults?
It is not at all important because I have realized working in pediatric neurosurgery for about 40 years or so, there is a tremendous confusion in IC monitoring. There is a whole booklet on CPP manipulation in pediatric head injury. It was written by Dr. DiRocco and other people also contributed. Because it is not uniform. Even in US, only 20 to 25 centers regularly do IC monitoring because it is expensive in US and also a long-term IC monitoring lead to problems. So even the IC monitoring is not routinely followed. Now coming to CPP, I don't feel today with all our knowledge, CPP manipulation is going to happen. The people, those who believe in CPP, they always have points for those who believe in ICP, they have point to favor. But if I have a choice between ICP and CPP, it is easier to manipulate ICP monitoring. But having said that, in pediatrics, ICP monitoring is still more difficult because for pediatric age group, there is no normal standardization. There is only one study done in 1990s and another study 2000, where Dr. Derek Bruce from Dallas had studied the intracranial pressure normative value in children. What we do adult, we manipulate the adult data to pediatric age group. So if I say for adult 20 millimeter of mercury refractory and extrapolate to the child, it's not going to work out because children have much lower ICP. So what an adult brain may not get damaged at 20, a child brain get damaged at 20. So we have to be very careful when extrapolate the adult data to pediatric case. You understand that?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Because there is no normative data for 5 years old child, 3 years old baby. When you talk pediatric above 10 years, when the skull is fixed and sutures are fused, it may some way simulate to the adult. So there is no uniformity below 5 years, the IC, and there is no normative data. That's the problem.
Can you give a comment on rescue trial output, sir?
Yes, rescue trial was very important. We were also part of it. But the question is that the data did not 100%. There are guidelines. They have told that ICP monitoring and decompression anatomy and outcome are parallel with each other. But when you do the long-term morbidity data, it shows that they are more vegetative. So 6 months survival has improved from death to vegetative. But if you take moderate head injury to recovery, they still have significant psychosocial problem. So if you only take survival and good outcome physically, they may be okay. But if you go to their cognitive parameters, which they did not too much include for long term, our problem is that even in minor head injury, cognitive paradigm is very high. So a person surviving of the severe head injury will have tremendous cognitive. So in a functional outcome, endocrinal, sexual, and cognitive parameters are never included in study. So we do not know long-term functional outcome.
Yes. And there is one question to Dr. Rupesh, like card edema, if it is there.
Can I leave? Can I leave?
Yeah, please, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you very
sir.
much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
I thank you very much.
Notice you have given us time, sir. Yeah, Rupesh, there is one question on the chat box, like there is card edema present. How many days of ventilation to be continued?
That's a very difficult question because it's not just a cord edema alone which matters. And whatever white we see, we are not sure whether it is a cord injury, the cord edema, or heart bleeding. It's very difficult to ascertain. Basically, it should be like a case-to-case basis. We need to identify, and probably ventilator setting can itself can tell how much the patient can tolerate the breathing. So the weaning off is a very gradual process, and we will not be in a hurry. Sometimes they need some amount of backup. So once a tracheostomy done, maybe you want to put them in a BiPAP before taking them completely off ventilator. But it all depends on the level of the injury and the amount of the cord injury.
Yeah. There is another question from my colleague, Dr. TVR Murthy. What is your policy on central cord syndrome with motor deficit and MRI showing no bony injury with multi-level cord compression spondylosis or OPLN?
Okay, yeah. So this question depends on the patient's age of the patient. If the patient is hemodynamically stable, and if the patient first for 48 hours, we can see whether the patient is further deteriorating. If the patient shows that from the level of the, if he starts neurological worsening, it's probably wise to go ahead and decompress and stabilize. If the patient is neurologically stable, and if it's not, then probably we can wait for 3 weeks for the cord edema to subside and then intervene the patient once the patient edema subsides, and that may be a safer period. So it depends on whether how the presentation is, and if the patient's behavior in the first 48 hours, that can decide us whether we can do immediately or we can wait and do.
Yeah. I have a question, like what is your take on spinal cord stimulation in chronic spinal cord injuries?
Yeah, so that's what, as of now, electrical stimulation, actually there are many physiotherapy. If you go to physiotherapy societies and if you talk to them, their main argument and main discussions are about electrical stimulation, which they are not using it properly. And in the West, the electrical stimulation is playing a major role in rehabilitation of these patients. So probably spinal cord stimulation, yes. Even for sacral nerve stimulation for patients with a complete bladder bubble, sacral nerve stimulation is also coming up in a big. But whether how much, we don't have much data on this to tell, because cost comes. Majority of these patients actually are already they have depleted all their money, and then at the end if they come suggest they need some, then most of the time. So we don't have much data to support whether they'll really benefit or not. But if you have some good insurance and the finance is not the problem, then we can, it's worthwhile giving, especially if the patient is a quite young patient who are long lived to live.
Yeah, there is one question, less than 8 years, why trauma drip not given?
Trauma drip. What is trauma drip?
Can you see that question on the chat box?
Yeah, less than 8 years, why trauma drip? I don't mean, what is trauma drip? Can you elaborate what is trauma drip? I don't get what is that.
I am not able to understand that.
Steroids or
a lot of participants are asking for the YouTube recording of this, and we will share the YouTube. Is already getting telecasted on the YouTube. We'll share all the details, and we are like developing a digital education channel under the aegis of TNS and APNSA. We'll be sharing the details with you, and we'll be uploading all these videos onto that digital education channel. Yeah, and there is another question to you, Dr. Rupesh.
Yeah, I think the methylprednisolone. So trauma drip is methylprednisolone. So as such, methylprednisolone is very unclear. So the data says strong giving against methylprednisolone, and there are no data to support methylprednisolone.
How do you prevent mass reflux in cord injury patient while catheterization?
So that is again, so they are having a high vagal tone, not only vagal tone, the same thing happens for this one also. So this way we say the urinary, whenever there is a urinary tract infection, the spasticity becomes very more. So baclofen is only one drug which we can use at any temperature, but mass reflux is preventing in mass reflux is, it is not going to happen in an acute stage. These reflexes will happen in a chronic phase, but by the time you already patients are on baclofen, so probably we can preload them a little bit more to prevent this complications. And if the patient is having fever, we can give him a nice paracetamol infusion to reduce the lower the body temperature, and then we can start doing the catheterization. But it is not a problem in acute phase. Usually it happens in a little longer term, in the long term phase.
Any suggestion on the medical treatment of the bladder problems?
Bladder problems, yes. So we need to have a good urologist who can really know what extent, and proper urodynamic studies can actually suggest us whether what is the underlying pathology. So basically we have two drugs only available now. One is to prevent, to have a good contraction, detrusor contraction. So where we have bethanechol. So bethanechol can help in a, not suddenly we should not give because these patients develop diarrhea. So in an incremental dose, so that the patient also doesn't develop diarrhea, and bethanechol helps to extend. The other problem is bladder sphincter dysenergia. So the detrusor tries to contract and the sphincter also contracts. So that's not like in an automatic bladder. So there is a drug called Terol. Terol is a specific sympatholytic, and so it causes sphincter relaxation. So in a spastic bladder, and it can help in relaxing the sphincter. So Terol is useful. Even it's more useful in pediatric actually. There are long-acting things are available. So I prefer Terol if the patient is having a high human type of bladder with a detrusor sphincter dysenergia. And a lower, of course, element bladder, bethanechol helps to in some patients.
Okay. I think there are no more questions. I think it was a pleasure to have you, Rupesh. And
Thank you for the opportunity, sir. I also really enjoyed
sharing so much of information on this subject. It is our pleasure. Thank you so much, Rupesh.
Thank you.
Looking forward for the future interactions like this.
Definitely.
Thank you. Thank you all the delegates, and you will have the webinar details shared with you, and you can see all these videos in the YouTube channel, which we are going to give you the details shortly. So thank you. Thank you, Sun Pharma. You want to say something, Srinivas?
Good evening, sir. Thanks for giving this opportunity on behalf of Sun Pharma. And future also will be continuing this kind of programs. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Narasimha Reddy, you want to say something?
Hello, sir.
Yeah, Narasimha Reddy.
Sir, thank you for giving this opportunity, sir. In future also will be associated with this kind of programs.
Okay. Thank you, Rajshekhar, and thank you, Ramakrishna.
Thank you, Basha sir.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We want all your support in starting that digital education channel under the aegis of TNS and APN.
Sure, sir. I have already created a YouTube channel, sir. I'll just share you the details, and whatever you get the videos, you can simply upload it, sir.
We'll continue our education on that channel also.
Sure, sir. Sure.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rupesh.
Thank you, sir.
All the best. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.